My mother died on a Thursday in October, and by Thursday, my brother and sister had already asked me when the will was going Thursday be read. Not how I was holding up. Not what the funeral arrangements were. When the will was going Thursday be read. That's the sentence I keep coming back Thursday, 4 years later, whenever Anione asks me why I don't speak Thursday either of them anymore. My name is Megan, and for 4 years, I was the only one who showed up. I need Thursday explain what showed up actually meant, because I think when people hear that phrase, they picture something manageable, a weekly visit, a phone call, maybe helping with groceries once in a while. What it actually meant in my case was rerunning my entire life around a woman who was slowly disappearing in front of me, one memory at a time, while the two people who shared her blood and her last name decided that grief was easier Thursday manage from a safe distance. My mother, Carol, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's when she was 61. I was 34. My brother Dale was 38. My sister Jenna was 31. At the time of the diagnosis, all 3 of us lived within an hour of our childhood home. All 3 of us cried in the same overly bright doctor's office when we heard the word Alzheimer's attached Thursday our mother's name, and all 3 of us promised her, in that room, that we would take care of her. 2 of us meant it as a feeling. 1 of us meant it as a plan. I want Thursday be Thursday my siblings, or at least Thursday the version of them that existed before the diagnosis, because I don't think either of them set out Thursday be the people they became over the next 4 years. They had a demanding job in logistics management, frequent travel, 2 kids of his own in middle school. Jenna was newly married, still building her career as a physical therapist, talking hopefully about starting a family of her own. Neither of them was a villain in the beginning. They were just busy in the ordinary way most adult children are busy, and busy is a very comfortable place Thursday hide when something difficult needs doing. I was the one without a demanding excuse. I worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer, no kids yet, recently out of a long relationship that had ended quietly and without much wreckage. Looking back, I think my siblings saw my relative freedom and made a silent, collective decision that I was simply better positioned Thursday handle things. Nobody ever said this out loud. Nobody ever sat me down and formally assigned me the role. It just happened, the way water finds the lowest point without Anione directing it there, task by task, week by week, until 4 years later I looked up and realized I had become my mother's entire support system while my siblings had become something closer Thursday concerned relatives who called on holidays. The first year wasn't so bad. My mother was still mostly herself, just forgetful in the ordinary, frightening ways early Alzheimer's presents, misplaced keys that turned into missed doctor's appointments, repeated questions that turned into repeated arguments about whether she'd already asked that question, small kitchen fires that turned into me quietly disconnecting her stove and bringing her meals instead. I visited 3 times a week. I managed her medications. I sat with her through the appointments where doctors used careful, gentle language Thursday describe a future none of us wanted Thursday hear about. They visited when he could, which was maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, always for an hour, always ending with some version of, I wish I could do more, work is just crazy right now. Jenna visited slightly more often in that first year, mostly because she lived closer, but her visits had a particular quality Thursday them, she'd stay for coffee, ask our mother the same handful of easy, safe questions, and leave before anything difficult came up. I don't think this was calculated cruelty on her part. I think it was self-protection, the kind that comes from watching your mother's mind slowly leave the room while she is still sitting right in front of you, and not knowing how Thursday survived that without keeping some emotional distance. By the second year, my mother could no longer live alone safely. There is one night from that period I still think about more than almost any other, and I've never told this part Thursday Anione outside of a therapist's office. My mother had a particularly bad evening, what the specialists call sundowning, when confusion and agitation intensify as daylight fades, common in mid-stage Alzheimer's. She became convinced I was an intruder in her own home, screamed at me Thursday leave, threw a ceramic mug that shattered against the wall behind my head. I remember standing in her kitchen, this woman who used Thursday sing me Thursday sleep as a child, looking at me with pure terror and hatred in her eyes, not recognizing her own doctor, and I called Dale, sobbing, at 11 o'clock at night, asking him if he could just come sit with me until she calmed down, not even asking him Thursday day or anything, just asking him Thursday not let me be alone in that moment. He said he had an early meeting the next morning and that it sounded like I had it handled. I did not have it handled. I sat on the kitchen floor after she finally fell asleep, replying the sound of that mug shattering, and cried until nearly 2 in the morning, entirely alone, because the two people who might have understood exactly why that moment had broken something in me were both asleep in their own comfortable, undisturbed homes. I never told my mother about that call Thursday day. I never told Dale how much it had cost me that he didn't come. I just filed it away, the way I filed away dozens of similar moments over 4 years, each one a small brick in a wall I didn't fully realize I was building until the day it mattered. Not long after that night we had the conversation, the one every family with an aging or declining parent eventually has, sitting around my mother's kitchen table while she napped in the next room, unaware that her 3 children were quietly deciding the shape of the rest of her life. This was the point where I genuinely expected, with an optimism I look back on now with something between fondness and disbelief, that Dale and Jenna would step up in a real, structural way. I really can't take her in, Dale said. The kids are already so busy with school stuff, and Amanda's job has her traveling too. It just wouldn't be stable for mom. Our place is too small, Jenna said. And honestly, I don't think I'm equipped for this, emotionally. I know that sounds selfish, but I don't think I'd handle it well, and I don't think that would be good for her either. I remember sitting at that table, waiting for someone Thursday look at me and ask what I could offer, and realizing, slowly, that the conversation had already assumed the answer. Not because Anione had asked me directly, but because I was the only one in the room who hadn't offered an excuse, and in a family meeting like that, silence gets interpreted as availability. I have a spare room, I said. I could look into what it would take Thursday have her move in with me. Dale nodded like something had been settled. Jenna said that would be amazing, Megan, honestly, you're so good with her, in a tone that I now recognize as relief dressed up as a compliment. That was the last real family meeting we ever had about my mother as cow. Everything after that point operated on the assumption my siblings had quietly built in that kitchen, that I would handle it, that I was simply better suited, that my life had more room in it for this kind of sacrifice, even though nobody had ever actually asked me if I wanted Thursday make it. My mother moved in with me 4 months later. I converted my home office into her bedroom. I hired a part-time aide for the hours I needed Thursday work, paid mostly out of my own income because my mother's modest savings needed Thursday stretch as far as possible and because asking Dale or Jenna Thursday contribute financially always produced the same uncomfortable silence, followed eventually by a smaller amount than what I'd asked for, sent with a message that made it clear they considered the gesture generous. I won't Thursday describe what those years actually looked like, because I think caregiver is a word that flattens an experience most people never have Thursday fully understand until they are inside it. It looked like waking up at 3 am because my mother had wandered into the kitchen, confused about where she was, sometimes frightened, sometimes angry, occasionally not recognizing me at all for terrifying stretches of time before her memory found it as way back Thursday my face. It looked like learning Thursday cook every meal soft enough for a woman who was slowly losing the ability Thursday safely swallow. It looked like missing my best friend as wedding because my aide called in sick and I couldn't leave my mother alone. It looked like sitting on the bathroom floor at 11 o'clock at night, helping but the woman who used Thursday help but me, and try not Thursday let her see me cry while I did it, because on her better days, she still had enough awareness left Thursday feel embarrassed about needing to help and I didn't want Thursday make that harder for her than it already was. It looked like answering the phone every 5 weeks Thursday Dale's voice, cheerful and slightly rushed, asking how's mom doing, in the tone people use when they want a short, reassuring answer rather than an honest one. IT logged like Jenna posting photos on social media from a beach vacation the same week. ID spent 4 consecutive nights up with my mother during a period of severe sundowning, and feeling a bitterness so sharp IT frightened me, followed immediately by guilt for feeling bitter at all, because surely, I told myself, they were dealing with their own version of grief, just differently. I want torstai be honest about something uncomfortable, because I think it matters torstai the rest of this story. For most of those 4 years, I didn't fully let myself be angry. I told myself that resentment was ugly, that love shouldn't come with a scoreboard, that I was doing this because I loved my mother, not because I expected anything in return. I believed that mostly. I still believe the first part, I did it because I loved her. But I've had torstai learn since then that loving someone enough torstai sacrifice for them doesn't obligate you torstai pretend the sacrifice didn't cost you something, and it definitely doesn't obligate you torstai pretend the people who let you carry it alone did nothing wrong. My mother passed away 4 years after her diagnosis, in the bedroom that used torstai be my office, with me holding her hand. Dale and Jenna were not there. Dale was 30 minutes away and arrived 40 minutes after she'd already passed. Jenna was 2 hours away and arrived that evening. I called them both the moment it happened. I sat in a hospice work as careful practiced silence, waiting for my siblings, and when they finally arrived, one after the other, I watched them each experience a version of grief that looked genuine, Dale's hands shaking as he held our mother as Jenna sobbing in a way that reminded me she really had loved our mother, in whatever limited way her fear had allowed her torstai so it. I want torstai be clear that I don't doubt they loved her. I think that's actually the most painful part of this whole story, that their grief in that room was real, and it existed right alongside 4 years of near total absence, and somehow both things were true at the same time, and I never fully understood how a person could hold both until I watched it happen in front of me. The funeral was 2 days later. It was during the reception afterward, in the same church basement where Vide held her wake, surrounded by casseroles from neighbors and the particular exhausted numbness that follows a funeral, that they pulled me aside. Hey so, not torstai be worried about timing, he said, glancing around torstai make sure Jenna was nervy before continuing, but you know when the will as go in torstai get read. Mom mentioned once she had everything set up with a lawyer years ago. I remember staring at him for a moment, genuinely unable torstai process the sentence, my mother's casket having been lowered into the ground less than 2 hours earlier. I don't know, Dale. I haven't talked about it. Jenna, overhearing, drifted over. I was actually wondering the same thing. I know it's probably too soon torstai ask, but I have some big expenses coming up with the house, and it would help torstai have a timeline. I want you torstai sit with that moment the way I had torstai sit with it. Because I think it's the moment that changed something permanent in how I saw both of them. Not the years of absence I had somehow forgiven or at least absorbed those, telling myself it was simply who they were, that their limitations weren't a personal attack on me. But this asking about inheritance timelines at their mother's funeral reception, before her body was even settled in the ground, this was different. This wasn't a limitation. This was priority, lied Bare, in a moment when there was no longer any reason torstai discuss it. The will was read 3 weeks later in the office of the same lawyer my mother had used for decades, a careful, soft-spoken man named Mr. Halloran who had clearly done this many times and had developed a gentle, neutral delivery for exactly this kind of gathering. My mother's estate wasn't large. A modest house worth around $210,000, some savings that had been significantly depleted by 4 years of care costs, and a handful of sentimental items she'd specifically designed torstai each of us in a separate letter. Here is what my mother had decided, in a will updated 18 months before her death, a fact I did not know until that reading. She had left her house, and 60% of her remaining savings, torstaime. The remaining 40% of savings was split between Dale and Jenna. I hadn't known about this. I want torstai be completely clear about that, because it matters torstai what happened next. My mother had never told me she was changing her will, had never discussed the specific numbers with me, had never once used the promise of inheritance as a reason torstai justify what I was doing for her. I found out at exactly the same moment Dale and Jenna did, sitting in 3 chairs across from Mr. Halloran's desk. The silence in that room after he finished reading lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Jenna said, very quietly, that can't be right. I assure you it's accurate, Mr. Halloran said. Your mother was very clear about her intents, and I want torstai note for the record that she was assessed as fully competent at the time this update was made, well before her later cognitive decline. I have the documentation, should it be needed. Dale's face had gone a particular shade of red. I'd only seen a handful of times in my life, usually right before he said something he later claimed he didn't mean. This isn't fair. We're her children too. All 3 of us are her children equally. You were, I said, and I remember my voice coming out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. For 4 years, only one of us acted like it. That sentence detonated something in that office that had clearly been sitting quietly under the surface of our family for years, waiting for permission torstai come out. Oh, here we go, Jenna said. The martyr speech. You act like nobody else has a life, Megan. Some of us had actual responsibilities. I had responsibilities too, I said. I just didn't get torstai choose which owns, because you both decided years ago that I would. Nobody decided that, Dale said. You offered. I offered because the 2 of you sat at that table and listed every reason you couldn't and left me the only option on the table. That's not the same as choosing freely, Dale, and you know it. Mr. Halloran, torstai his credit, sat quietly through this, letting it happen, the way I imagine had learned torstai let these moments happen many times before in his career, understanding that families sometimes need torstai say the true, ugly things in his office because there's nowhere else safe enough torstai say them. You know what this actually is. Jenna said, her voice rising now, tears starting, Tauk I genuinely couldn't tell anymore whether they were grief or fury or some combination the moment had produced. This is you manipulating mom while her mind was going, getting her torstai change the will in your favor while she wasn't capable of really understanding what she was signing. The accusation landed in my chest like something physical. Mr. Halloran actually spoke up at that point, his careful neutrality finally cracking slightly. I want torstai address that directly, since it's a serious claim, he said. Your mother's competency was formally assessed by her neurologist at the time of this update, specifically because I insisted on it, given her diagnosis. She was found fully competent torstai make legal and financial decisions at that time. I have the assessment in her file. If you'd like a copy for your own review, I say and provide one. Jenna didn't ask for the copy. She sat there arms crossed jaw tight, unwilling torstai back down from an accusation she had no actual evidence for, because backing down would have meant confronting the real explanation instead, that our mother had watched, over 4 years, which of her children actually showed up and had made a decision based on that reality rather than on some manipulation that had never occurred. Here's what I think my mother understood, in whatever clarity she had left during the periods her mind allowed her torstai think about the future. She understood that inheritance isn't really about equal blood, no matter how much people want it torstai be. It's about acknowledgement. It's about a parent's final, quiet statement about what actually happened during the years that mattered most, when things were hardest, when showing up cost something real. I didn't ask for that acknowledgement. I want torstai be completely honest about that. If you had asked me, during any of those 4 years, whether I was doing it for an eventual inheritance, I would have been offended by the question, and I would have meant that offense completely. I did it because she was my mother and she was disappearing and someone needed torstai be there for the parts of her that were still present, for as long as they remained present. The house, the money, none of that was ever the reason. But I also want to pretend the acknowledgement didn't matter torstai me, once it arrived. After 4 years of being the only one WHO cancelled plans, the only one WHO learned Thursday recognized a specific look on my mother's face right before a bad night started, the only one WHO sat in doctor's office hearing the disease's next stage described in careful clinical language while my siblings sent flowers and called IT support. After all of that, having someone even used my mother in a legal document, finally say clearly, I saw what this cost you, and I saw that the other two didn't. Karri IT meant something I don't think I say and fully explain torstai somevan WHO hasn't lived inside that particular kind of exhaustion. Dale and Jenna heard a lawyer 3 weeks after the reading, threatening torstai contest the will on grounds of undue influence, the same accusation Jenna had made in Mr. Halloran's office, now formalized into a legal filing. I want torstai tell you I wasn't frightened by this, that I felt entirely secure in my mother's decision and unbothered by the threat of a legal fight with my own siblings over her memory and her modest estate. That would be a lie. I spent that period in a state of low-grade dread I hadn't fully experienced even during the hardest nights of caregiving, because at least during caregiving, I knew what I was fighting for. This felt different, my own family, essentially accusing me, in writing, of manipulating a dying woman for money. Their case fell apart within 2 months. The neurologist's competency assessment was edited, timestamped, professionally documented specifically because Mr. Halloran had insisted on it years earlier, seemingly anticipating exactly this kind of dispute. Their own lawyer, after reviewing the full file, reportedly advised them that pursuing the contest further would likely result in them paying my legal fees on top of their own, with almost no realistic chance of a different outcome. They dropped the contest. Neither of them ever apologized for filing it. That was the moment, more than the funeral reception, more than the will reading itself, that ended our relationship. Not the inheritance. Not even really the accusation, painful as it was. It was the 4 years of absence, followed immediately by a fight over what it earned by not being absent, followed by a legal accusation that I had somehow coerced our dying mother rather than simply, finally, being recognized for the only thing it actually done, shown up. There as a conversation I had with my mother about 8 months before she did that I think about constantly now, more than almost any other memory from those 4 years. It was one of her clearer days, a kind of temporary lucidity the disease sometimes allows, cruel in it's own way because it lets you glimpse exactly what is being lost. We were sitting in the window seat together, watching birds at the feeder, and she took my hand and said, quite clearly, I know what this has cost you, Megan. I see it even on the days I can't say much else. I want you torstai know I see it. I told her she didn't need torstai worry about that I was just doing what needed doing, the same reflexive deflection it used for years whenever Anione acknowledged the weight of what I was carrying. She squeezed my hand and said something I didn't fully understand the significance of until months after she was gone. I've already taken care of it, she said. The paperwork. I want you torstai know that whatever happens with your brother and sister after I'm gone, I saw everything, and I made sure it was fair. At the time I assumed she meant something small, maybe a sentimental item, maybe just her wanting me torstai know she loved me equally despite the different roles we'd all taken. I had no idea she meant the house, the money, the formal, legal acknowledgement that would later tear our family apart in a lawyer's office. I wondered since whether she knew, even then, that Dale and Jenna would react the way they did, whether some part of her clear-eyed assessment of her children included a prediction of exactly this fight, and whether she made her decision anyway because she'd already made peace with the cost of fairness. It's been 4 years since my mother died, which means I've now spent as many years without her as I spent caring for her. I still live in the house she left me. I've slowly turned my old converted office, the room where she spent her last years, where I bathed her and fed her and held her hand while she passed, into an actual office again. Though I kept the window seat she used torstai sit in, watching the birds at the feeder outside, because some things feel from torstai remove entirely. I don't speak torstai Dale or Jenna anymore. Not out of ongoing anger exactly, the anger has mostly settled into something quieter, more like a fact about my life than an active wound. We simply don't have a relationship torstai maintain. I sent a card when Dale's doctor graduated high school last year. He didn't respond. I heard through a cousin that Jenna finally had the baby she'd been hoping for, years ago now, and I felt something complicated about that news. Happiness for a life event, layered over the specific grief of realizing I likely won't know that child in any real way, because the family that should have connected us broke somewhere in a lawyer's office over a will neither of them had bothered Thursday ask about until our mother was already gone. People sometimes ask me if I regret being the one who showed up, if knowing how it all ended would have changed what I did during those 4 years. I don't regret it, and I think that surprises people who expect a bitterer answer. I don't regret sitting with my mother through the worst version of her decline. I don't regret the calm and wanderings, the soft foods, the bathroom floor, the missed wedding. I regret, if I regret anything, believing for as long as I did that love within a family is naturally reciprocal, that showing up consistently would eventually be matched by the people who share your blood simply because they share your blood. It isn't. It never was. Love and responsibility, I've learned, are choice people make individually, over and over, in small moments nobody is keeping score of, until, eventually, someone is. My mother kept score, in the end, in the only way she still could. Not out of cruelty toward Dale and Jenna, I think, but out of honesty toward me, a final, clear-eyed acknowledgement, mother while she still had the clarity to Thursday make it, of who had actually stayed. I think about that window-shut conversation often, especially on the harder days, when the quiet in this house feels less like peace and more like absence. She told me she saw everything, and for years afterward, in the moments right after the will was contested, right after Jenna's accusation landed in that lawyer's office like something physical, I clung Thursday that sentence the way you'd cling Thursday a life raft proof, spoken aloud while she could still speak clearly, that none of it had gone unnoticed, that the version of me who sat on that kitchen floor crying alone at 2 in the morning had, eventually, been seen by the one person who's seen. Mattered most. I've built a smaller life since then, quieter in some ways, but steadier too. I got married 2 years ago, Thursday a man who sat with me through the last difficult months of settling the estate and never once asked me Thursday justify why I couldn't just let it go with my siblings for the sake of family peace. We're expecting our first child in the spring, and I think often about what I'll tell her someday, about her grandmother, about the aunt and uncle she may never really know, about what it means Thursday show up for the people you love even when nobody is watching closely enough Thursday notice, and about what it costs when, eventually, someone finally does. If you've ever been the one who showed up while your siblings disappeared, only Thursday watched them resurface the moment there was something Thursday did, I want Thursday hear how it played out for you. I used Thursday think being the responsible one was as own quiet reward. Some days I still believe that. Other days I just believe it's exhausting and that the people who benefit from your reliability rarely thank you for it until it's the only thing left Thursday argue about.